So this is a cartoon, and I want to make sure that it is obvious that it's a cartoon by having some background objects move in a cartoony way. So I'm going to start with this barrel. I think that I'd like to have this barrel maybe doing a little bouncy from side to side. Maybe it's like waving from side to side, or doing a little squash and stretch up and down. And so we could do a lot more complex rigging on this, but really the easiest way to do this is probably the nonlinear deformer. I'm going to go ahead and turn on my environment so I can see what's around it and make sure it's not bumping into anything. And actually, now that I've done this, I see that it's actually quite a ways away from the wall. Maybe I'll move it a little closer to the wall and see from our angle how that looks. Yeah. So just getting it in here somewhere. So to do this, just as we saw in the previous video, we're going to go to our animation menu. It's also listed under your rigging menu. And we're going to go to deform. And we're going to look at our nonlinear deformers that we might be able to use to give an interesting look or feel to this. And I'm going to go ahead and break this tab off just so we have it here. I can do that anytime I want to by clicking on these little double lines. And so it becomes a little menu that just floats. So since our wooden barrel is a single object, like all of this meshes together, I can just select a single object to apply the deformer. Now, again, recognize that what the deformers are good for. And in this case, I could still animate the object moving on the object level if I just wanted it to bounce around or feel like it had somebody in it and it was wiggling or something like that. I don't. I want it to bend, right? And there is no combination of translates, rotates, or scales that would make this object bend in the middle. And I don't want to have to go in here and grab every one of these vertices and animate it by moving those individually, which is an option, but highly, highly unadvised. So that's where the deformers come in. The deformers allow me to animate vertices and faces en masse while having very few controls that make it clearer for me to understand what's going on. So to do this, I'm also going to make a little bit of a rig just so it makes it a little easier to animate. And I think I want to do a mix of two things. I want to do a bend and I want to do a squash. So with it selected, I'm just going to hit the bend, and you will see that if I hit 4, the bend deformer is inside of the model there, and if I just added some curvature, I'm able to get this to bend from left to right. If I get back to this view, you'll be able to see it bend. All right. This is not exactly how I want it to bend. I would prefer it to bend, as we were looking at our cylinder, from the bottom. And so remember how we did that. I move my pivot point all the way down to the bottom, which is actually going to end up being 0 in my translate Y. I'm going to remove all of my low bound influence down to 0, and I'm going to extend my high bound influence up to about 2. And so now that deformer, that bend handle, has the pivot point at the bottom, and all of our curvature is going to happen above that because I've taken the low bound off. And so now I have a very simple bend there on it. And if you look at this from this angle, that's a little bit more fun. So I'm going to select it again, and I'm going to add a squash to this. And I want to do mostly the same stuff on the squash, because if I affect squash and stretch here, it's going to squash and stretch toward the middle of the barrel, which may be what you want sometimes, but at this point I want it to squash and stretch from the ground. Right, so again, set my translate Y to 0 to put my squash and stretch on the ground. Go ahead and hit 4. Oh. Enter. And I'm going to go ahead and hit 4 out here just so I can see my squash handle. I'm going to take my low bound down to 0, take my high bound up to 2. This is interesting, though. If you want to look at this, I'm going to undo this just so you understand why those are the numbers we're picking. If we look at the range that is covered in this, it is from -1 to 1, which is 2 units. Right? So essentially this squash and stretch is happening, well, not 2 units, but a total of 2. Right? It's not specifically a Maya unit. A Maya unit's much smaller than that. So it's the top half and the lower half, which is equal to 2. And really what I'm saying here is I don't want you to look at anything below the pivot point. I just want you to look for 2 height segments above the pivot point instead. And so that's going to allow us to get a factor that looks a little bit more like this. And so I really like how that's looking. And yeah. So we're seeing some really interesting squash and stretch happening in there now. So if we combined the two, we would probably get some pretty neat stuff. However, what if I wanted it to jump in? Like, if I wanted it to jump in, we need to recognize that I have 3 different things that are causing these deformations here. If I adjust my curvature on this, and I adjust my squash on this, and then I tried to move this, I'm going to get some really, really bad results, right? Or if I tried to move my squash and stretch handle by itself, I get some different results, right? All of this is connected to the current space that this object is in, which makes it a little harder to maneuver, right? I'm also just kind of looking here. It looks like maybe I'm just going to extend my high bound to something like 2.2 and the same on my squash, just to see if that helps any. Yeah, that kind of helps that little corner that was, I think, falling outside of the range of the squash and stretch. And so now we got a pretty neat setup, but I can't really do much with it except for have it animate in place. And that is really all I want to do right now. But even to do that, to animate this, I have to go here to the bend handle and set some keyframes on the curvature, and then I would go to the squash handle and set some keyframes on the factor, and back and forth, and that's a lot to keep track of. It's a lot of clicking, right? And really, a rig is just a way of minimizing or simplifying the way an animator interacts with the thing that they're animating. So again, let's make this easier on ourselves and just make us a control for this. So I want to create a circle, NURB circle, that is right there. And where is it at? Okay, so I'm going to scale it up, and to get it over here closer to our objects, I'm just going to pick one of our deformers and then click the circle. And I believe that's the right order. If I go to Modify, Match Transformations, and Match Translations. Oh, I did it backwards. So let's do instead the circle, and then the deformer, Modify, Match Translations, and that's going to move our circle over to the pivot point of the squash and stretch handle that we had selected. All right. And so this can be our control. And to make this a little easier, I'll call this barrel CTRL control. And to make this easier on us, I'm just going to go ahead and parent all 3 of these things underneath that barrel control. Okay. And so now, just like I have with my box, if I just grab that barrel control, I can move this whole group around. Right? And I could animate this jumping around. But I still want to simplify this a little bit more. So something I do need to do is freeze these transformations. So I'm going to go Modify, Freeze Transformations, and that messes stuff up when I do that. And the reason that messes it up is because I parented this stuff underneath the barrel control before I froze those transformations. So let's undo a few things to before I put those in there. And so this is one of the reasons to always remember to check this. I want all these values to be clean first before I parent this stuff underneath it. So Modify, Freeze Transformations, Edit, Delete by Type History, and now I can probably parent this stuff underneath here pretty cleanly, and my barrel control has clean values on it. All right. And so that means if I ever need to, if I'm animating this around and I ever need to get my barrel back over here to where it started, I can just type in 0 for those values and it comes back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add additional controls or additional values on this control to allow us to control the bend and the squash. And so we will pick that up in the next video, just so this video doesn't get too long.